Good morning and welcome to this virtual service of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Arlington. My name is Lila Herndon-Vizard and I serve on UUCA's Board of Trustees. Happy Sunday from my space to yours, whether you're joining us from somewhere here in Arlington or the National Capital Region, from across the country or somewhere around the world. I especially want to welcome those of you who may be joining us today for the first time. We are so happy to have you with us. I invite you all to join us after the service for our virtual coffee hour. The link is available in Connections on Facebook and on the UUCA website. Also, today is the fourth night of Hanukkah, and we send our greetings and affection to all of you who are celebrating. As we enter this holiday season, there is so much happening and changing in the world around us. I am finding it more important than ever to find time to create moments of quiet and stillness, to let go of the tasks and the stress and the news, and to refocus on the things that matter and give me inspiration and grounding. So as we gather this morning to recenter from the busy week that's passed and to renew and refresh our energies for the week to come, let us take a deep breath and come together as a community in worship.
Our call to worship comes from the Reverend Sunshine Jeremiah Wolf. This is a congregation that gathers in faith. Not faith in one religion or one God or any one way. We gather in faith of the power of diversity, the power of love, and the hope of a world transformed by our care. We gather in faith in ourselves and those around us. Not a faith that requires perfection or rightness in one another. Rather, a faith that in our shared imperfection, we may learn to stumble and fall together. Faith that we will help one another to rise and to try again and again. We are Unitarian Universalists. Let us worship together.
Good morning. I am Marietta Tanner, UUCA's envoy to the Unitarian Universalist United Nations Organization at the UN. You remember us as UUUNO, but we have changed our name and are now subsumed under UUA. We continue to be the liaison with our church and the United Nations. We celebrate this week the establishment of the Declaration of Human Rights, one of the first significant actions of the United Nations in 1947. It was considered to be pie in the sky to its detractors, but found to have had far-reaching effects on the downtrodden peoples of the world. Why have I been so dedicated to the United Nations? I was 16 years old in 1943 when I first heard about the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, where President Roosevelt had asked Secretary of State Cordell Hull to help develop an organization to supersede the League of Nations, which had failed. This organization was to have the power to prevent war. Within a few months, my high school social studies club would be invited to attend a conference at the World Affairs Association in Philadelphia, where we met Undersecretary of State Stettinius and other dignitaries. They told us about an international organization which Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt had agreed to at Malta. It would soon convene in San Francisco to formally approve the founding of the United Nations. I never forgot that Foreign Affairs Club meeting. I read everything I could about the UN throughout college. I continued my association with a fledgling youth group that was supporting it. I found a job at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace building across the street. I had hoped to work for the United Nations itself, but my race was a handicap. But at this organization where I was working, I had a benevolent boss who was a wealthy supporter of all things United Nations. Through her, I met Adelaide Stevenson and Marietta Tree, and spoke often with the affable and astute Eleanor Roosevelt herself. I attended many sessions at the General Assembly and helped form an African-Asian alliance where we were working to try to help working with delegates who were trying to free the nations of Africa from colonialism. When Eleanor formed the American Association of the United Nations, I became a member and continue to belong to this day. We UUs owe much to the Declaration of Human Rights as it echoes in our principles, and to the United Nations itself, as UUs devoted much love and energy to its founding and growth. As we light the chalice today, may the warmth and its glow keep alive the United Nations as it struggles for world peace and human rights for all the world's peoples.
This week, we light the candles for love, hope, and joy. May you find joy sailing like birds throughout our beautiful world.
Good morning. My name is Lauren Weber, and I'm a recent high school graduate who voted for the first time in November. I felt the pride of being a U.S. citizen and my obligation to exert my rights and to fulfill my responsibilities. I want to understand the privileges being an American offers and to develop a deeper awareness of how they came about, understanding that for me, they were exceptionally hard-won. To me, Eleanor Roosevelt's life demonstrates the importance of a commitment to human rights. Around the world, human rights that we take for granted, guaranteed by our Constitution and enhanced by amendments to that document, are not available at all. After World War II, when the Holocaust and armed conflict slaughtered millions of armed forces and civilians of many nations, our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, proposed extending human rights to all persons on the planet through a newly formed United Nations. He was prodded toward this course by his wife, Eleanor, who had been his eyes and ears during his presidency. Eleanor demonstrated her commitment to human rights throughout her life. For example, Eleanor associated openly with Black people, which was not common in the 1930s and 40s. She had Franklin form a Black cabinet with college president Mary McLeod Bethune as its head. She also talked often with students at historically Black colleges. Eleanor demonstrated the preamble of the UN Charter asserts a determination to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and nations, large and small. Franklin died in April of 1945 before he could initiate the world body. His successor, Harry Truman, appointed Eleanor as the delegate to the United Nations. Why was Eleanor the absolute best person to receive this important assignment? Eleanor, shown on the right, was a child of privilege. She was the niece of President Theodore Roosevelt and was educated mostly by tutors. Her mother mocked her looks, which made her self-conscious and shy as a young girl. Fortunately, she was sent to England, to a school where she excelled and learned about social responsibility and independence for young women. At 18, she was a debutante but cared nothing for the glamorous life. She did social work instead and joined a group trying to end unsafe and child working conditions in factories. Her fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Harvard student, was attracted to her, and they were married in 1905. Eleanor asserted herself, opposing her opinionated mother-in-law, who felt that Franklin should withdraw from public life after he contracted polio in 1921. Eleanor supported his run for governor in 1928 and his run against Herbert Hoover for the presidency in 1932. The stock market had crashed in 1929. People were starving, and Eleanor saw new possibilities for herself as First Lady in Washington. She championed humanitarian causes, and since Franklin could not walk, she did the traveling for him. She wired him daily about the people she met and what they needed. She gave talks and supported disadvantaged groups, including the homeless, racial minorities, immigrants, and farmers. History applauded her for resigning from the Daughters of the American Revolution because they refused to allow the famous contralto, Marian Anderson, to sing at Constitution Hall because she was Black. Marian Anderson was a Philadelphia-born contralto, celebrated throughout the world, whom Toscanini said had a voice only heard once in 100 years. Eleanor arranged for Marian Anderson to sing at Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday, 1939, to a crowd of thousands. For her outspoken championing of minorities and other disadvantaged people, J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI considered Eleanor to be a communist. She revolutionized the role of a First Lady. She did not stay in the background. She spoke out for human rights and gave press conferences, insisting on women reporters, which altered the role of women in the press. Eleanor loved her work with the United Nations. She considered what she did there to be her most worthy accomplishments. She worked closely with Adlai Stevenson, a highly intellectual Unitarian, who would become governor of Illinois. He offered space for her meetings at the All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church in Manhattan because of the unorthodox and questionable status of some of her guests. Eleanor continued her practice of talking with the people affected by the issue at hand. The UN General Assembly set up a commission to promote human rights. Truman appointed Eleanor to the commission that would define the violation of human rights within a nation as a menace to the peace and security of the world. The task was daunting, but Eleanor devoted the next 2 years of her life to it. Concerns of national sovereignty threatened to destroy the work, but Eleanor persevered through exhaustive debates, reminding those gathered that the Declaration must serve as a counterforce to the fear and horror exposed by World War II. In the end, faced with political turmoil at home and abroad, the document was completed. Eleanor said that it was a document that all men may aspire to, without legal value, but with strong moral weight. Its influence has been tremendous, its ideas finding their way into constitutions of organizations and governments worldwide. Unitarians have been greatly influenced by its content. Thank you so much for listening to Time for All Ages.
I invite you now into a time of prayer or meditation with these words from the Reverend Marjorie Bowens Wheatley and the Reverend Clyde Grubbs. O great creative spirit, you have given a vision of the good, and we yearn for a new way. But where are we to find the courage to begin this work? We know that a different tomorrow is possible, but how can we build it? We think of the prophets, women and men who voiced unpopular opinions, who made personal sacrifices and sometimes lost their lives for the sake of justice. We think of Isaiah, who called out to let those who are held in captivity go free, to give solace to the poor and homeless. Let us be inspired by all who work to overcome misery, poverty, and exploitation. We think of Harriet Tubman, who called out to people of goodwill to join her on an underground railroad, to lift a dehumanized people from the bondage of slavery to the promise of freedom, even when it meant challenging unjust laws. Let us be inspired by those who are outlaws for freedom. We think of Gandhi, whose belief in soul force, the witness to love's truth, helped to overthrow the oppression of an empire and gave witness to the way of nonviolent action. Let us be inspired to become witnesses for peace. We think of Chief Seattle, who reminded us that we belong to the earth, not the earth to us. Let us be inspired by all those who work for the healing of creation, of Mother Earth and all her creatures. Who are the prophets that inspire you? They may be well known or known only by you, offering personal inspiration, courage, and hope. May they join a great cloud of witnesses to a new way of life, the way of peace and justice, the way of justice lived according to the way of peace, the beloved community. Friends, in this time, it is important that we do not walk alone, that we join together in this beloved community. If you need a listening ear, please reach out to pastoralcare@uucava.org. We are here for you. Amen.
Corazón, cantaré tu compasión. Hello, Arlington. I am so grateful to be here with you all today as we celebrate the observation of International Human Rights Day and the work of Unitarian Universalists at the United Nations. Thank you, Amanda, for inviting me, and Laura for your help with all of my tech needs. When Amanda told me about this month's theme, Stillness, I kind of chuckled to myself. December is usually really quite a busy time of year. It often means rushing between school, kid-related festivities, holiday get-togethers, or engaging in ritual and traditions, participating in Advent, or getting together your end-of-year card mailings, or gift-giving, baking. But this year is different. Our table this past Thanksgiving was just my two husbands, my kids, and myself. We really hope to see our extended family soon, but we're not sure when. And we recognize that we're lucky to have each other, to have our home, to have our health and our needs met. There's really a sense of stillness within us, sometimes. It's hard to maintain, though. Even without the parties and the school performances or the travel of previous holiday seasons, there's a constant calculation of how we need to be in order to keep our families safe that is really mentally exhausting. It's interesting because when the pandemic first hit earlier this year, that sense of business and productivity that I had always been engaged in, whether it be work, home, it was suddenly disrupted. And then took hold the busy days at first of being trying to adjust to this new routine with kids Zooming and parents juggling the schedules and trying to meet all the demands and get the groceries in. That was the daily struggles of quarantine life. But after we got used to that, the expansiveness of the unknown began to really set in. I'll share with you that the unknown was unsettling for all of us at UUSC. I kind of consider myself a pretty confident and steady person, but honestly, there's nothing like leading a human rights organization at this moment. This is a time where a major US election could have gone wrong. Hello, cruel Trump presidency and the threats to our democracy. We're through a global pandemic that literally impacted every single one of our partners. And you sprinkle in global Black Lives Matter uprisings and systemic racism and the urgency, but also the opportunity to make change in this moment, there's definitely a question for how do you focus and resource this work. However, amidst the complexity and the cruelty that I found in the stillness that wasn't going to mean quiet this year, that didn't mean tranquility, that didn't mean all was calm, still this year really meant for me that this year was about steadiness. I'm kind of reminded of an image civil rights activist Valerie Carr offered 4 years ago at the beginning of the era of disquiet and growing threats to human rights we thought we could take for granted. She says, "What if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country that is waiting to be born? What if the story of America is one of long labor? What if our grandfathers and grandmothers are standing behind us now, whispering to us, 'You are brave'? What if this is our nation's greatest tradition? What does the midwife tell us to do? To breathe and to push. Tonight we will breathe, and tomorrow we must labor." The complexity and the cruelty feel a lot like death. But Carr invites us to turn that around so that we can ground ourselves in the ongoing birth of humanity, the labor of generations to recognize and realize the value and the dignity of every human life. Therefore, the stillness of the womb is not tranquil or calm. It is a steady breathing, breathing and pushing, laboring. For me, the biggest challenge of human rights work is staying present to what's happening in the world without giving in to the despair or the hopelessness. Activist and author Naomi Klein recently said, "Politics hates a vacuum. If it isn't filled with hope, someone will fill it with fear." Since then, my practice has always been to hold the pain of today's world in the present while reflecting on the steadiness of the potential for change, focusing on the strength of the human spirit, the stories of powerful human rights actors around the world, and the story of the never-ending movement for human rights. So today I want to offer you some of those stories. I want to take some time to pause together, to reflect, and to think about how to move forward steadily together with our values and the dignity of every human being at the heart of all that we do. So the first story I want to share is about a congregation and a community just like yours coming together with compassion and persistence to accompany and support a person finding her freedom. It's funny enough, the story of how I found my way to the UU Service Committee. So some years ago, I worked for a civil rights firm in New York City where the lead attorney kind of humored me and said I could do some pro bono work by connecting me to his UU congregation, which happened to be in Ridgewood, New Jersey. So I reached out to these 4 passionate UU women from the Ridgewood Social Justice Network who happened to spend their free time visiting detained asylum seekers in some of the many large detention centers throughout New Jersey. One of the women that they met was a woman named Betty. Betty was a Liberian refugee who had escaped the rebel forces during the reign of Charles Taylor, the former president and now convicted war criminal. Betty's story was that after witnessing her sibling's death by rebel forces, she fled the country and came to the United States as a refugee. She had lived here almost 7 years, just shy of the residency requirement to become a U.S. citizen, when a minor shoplifting incident landed her in a detention facing deportation. She had no representation. She suffered from severe PTSD. Her kids had been taken into Child Protective Services, and she lost her initial case really because of basic procedural mishaps, and also because the immigration courts value expediency over justice. But Betty was resilient and determined. After all, what is the Department of Homeland Security compared to facing down rebel forces? It was then that my UU social justice networks visited Betty each week. They connect with her children's government representative, and they started to help piece together the documents to her case. Next began our journey together, a 3-year process, 3 years, to win Betty's case. During this time, I really became to depend on the generosity of the local congregation and their passionate commitment to help. Eventually, we found the psychologist who treated Betty in detention. He was able to testify about her PTSD, and the court ruled for Betty's human rights. She was released and reunited with her children after 4 long years living in detention. This is a story about kindness. It's a story about courage and steadiness that made Betty's freedom possible. First and foremost, her own, but very importantly, also the work of a few caring individuals. I've learned from Amanda that you're doing your own accompaniment work here in Arlington, some of you as individuals and in your immigration task force. I'm sure you could tell your own stories. And I'm grateful that I met those UUs in Ridgewood, and I continue to be inspired as I see this kind of work being done in many UU congregations. If you look across this country at visitation networks, you'll see there's always a UU congregation connected to it. Unfortunately, given today's political context, Betty's case might surely have become a tragic statistic in an ICE Immigrations and Customs Enforcement report where a so-called criminal alien was deported because of their conviction. Unfortunately, though, being seen as a danger rather than someone who is facing danger, being criminalized and then denied basic support are not unique to this Trump administration nor this country. These examples can be seen throughout history and around the world today. But this is one of the reasons why at UUSC, we focus on addressing systems and policies that criminalize people and deny people the right to migrate. We work in 3 broad areas. They're all intersectional: migrant justice, climate justice, and crisis response. And what's most important to know about UUSC's work is that the heart of our work is the capacity of community-driven local efforts to build large-scale systemic change. Since our founding 80 years ago, UUSC has sought to leverage international mechanisms to support community-driven change for human rights. The United Nations was founded on the collective goodwill of the nations coming together to address mass atrocity and to protect a human's basic right to dignity. The work in Martha and Waitstill Sharp was the beginning of UUSC, when UUs engaged in international cooperation and diplomacy to enact their rescue mission in Nazi-occupied Europe to save children. So today, UUSC continues to leverage the international systems and the principles of interconnectedness and cooperation for our common good. Working with UN mechanisms, we and our partners around the globe are advocating for this change, both locally and internationally. I want to talk a little bit about Burma, where power is divided between a military regime with a long and awful bloody history of human rights violations, and currently has a nominally civilian government that is unwilling to speak out against the military's actions for fear of losing its tenuous power. As a result of this, persecution and disenfranchisement continues against the ethnic Muslim Rohingya, a stateless minority who are denied citizenship. UUSC works with the Rohingya-led civil society organizations to support capacity building on the ground for Rohingya and multi-faith networks to do both education and outreach on the issues, and to work to really change hearts and minds in the face of what is seen as pervasive discrimination against ethnic minorities by the Buddhist majority. We're also supporting documentation of the crimes of atrocity by the military on the ground in northern Rakhine, as well as providing humanitarian relief to those stuck in internal displacement camps. Our work continues to track the ongoing international justice and accountability efforts, as well as resource the collective UN engagement and advocacy of a network of Rohingya youth organizations wanting truth and reconciliation. I also want to talk a little bit about Alaska and the South Pacific, where indigenous communities are suffering a different type of displacement as climate change is driving them from their homes, somewhat of a metaphorical, slow-moving tsunami. This summer, UUSC staff members met with indigenous communities in the islands of the South Pacific to help plan for irrevocable changes to their way of life. People who are still struggling to convince international agencies of the reality of climate change displacement, even as many people have been forced to relocate from their ancestral homelands. Over the last few years, UUSC has built an international coalition of community groups in the Pacific and the U.S. who are working now together to advance policy change both at the local and the international level. We've helped facilitate their access to international forums, including the UN Climate Change Summit, events at the UN General Assembly, and the Conference of Parties to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, both to share their solutions and support their media engagements to tell their stories. So I just want to pause for a moment after telling you some of these stories, because all of these injustices can seem disparate and far removed from one another, but they're in fact pretty deeply intertwined. The Rohingya refugees of Myanmar are connected to refugee siblings in the Americas and to people displaced by climate change in the Pacific. Systemic inequities are driven by racism, competition, individualism, can stigmatize and leave out the needs of whole communities. And authoritarian leaders, by their actions, will contribute to a world where governments think they can violate the rights of others with impunity. I will say, though, fortunately at UUSC, we're lucky to hear some of the stories as we work with some of the most remarkable human rights activists around the world. These are people who wake up each day not quite sure what their efforts may bring for their communities, but who continue on anyway because of their steady belief in love, equality, and humanity. These are communities that have had to work outside of and around power structures, facing threat from oppressive and often violent public institutions. So each day, I draw strength from the stories of our partners. I feel very lucky to be able to hear them and see the photos and visit with these communities, because we know that change is possible. After all, human rights movements have been defying colonialist and authoritarian oppression for decades. Human rights movements have disrupted entrenched systems of economic, political, social, cultural, and racial oppression. And the fight for humans to own their own self-determination is really at the heart of everything we do at UUSC. Though the struggle for human rights very rarely offers an opportunity for stillness, we hope that in partnership with UUSC, you are reminded that by joining hands, we will together discover the steadiness that is required to face the urgent challenges before us. And if you're like me, you're finding it hard to locate the stillness of this season of darkness and certainty. So I leave you with the hard-won wisdom from human rights defenders around the world. Steady on. You are needed. As we join hands for human rights, breathing together, pushing forward together, we are giving birth to a more just and loving world. So I just want to take this moment to thank you for being part of UUSC's journey to build a more just and loving world. And I want to wish you all a very courageous and hopeful and steady new year. Thank you.
UUCA is an incredible, dedicated, and busy community. As I have gotten to know UUCA over the last several months, I am amazed by how much is happening across the virtual time and space. We continue to gather together in large groups and small, reminding one another how vital this community is. To continue offering your support of UUCA, you can mail a check payable to UUCA with the word offering or pledge in the memo line. You can give online at the church website, uucava.org. Just click on the donate button on the top of the page. Or you can donate by text or by using the mobile app, Give Plus. Just enter the zip code 22204 and choose our church, UUCA, and follow the prompt to give now. Thank you for your generosity.
This is a quote from Arundhati Roy, an Indian author and civil rights activist. To love, to be loved, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to respect strength and never power, above all, to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and never, never to forget.